Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about the passive voice. It's not a common topic on Instagram, but it's one that I think is important as we continue to talk about verbs. So we've looked at past simple, past continuous, and present perfect. We're going to look at passive before we move to conditional. So the passive voice, how, when, and why to use it. And I think this should be very helpful to a lot of people. So let's get started. The source that I'm taking most of my examples from is from Michael Swan. It's a very popular English usage. I will have some of my own examples, and we disagree a little bit on a few things. But in general, this is a very good source if you want to look at it. Now let's look at the passive voice forms, because this is obviously important to know the forms, and I've got a bigger screen to my right. I'm going to read them. But you've got the simple present, which is common. English is spoken here. Now, the active form is that people speak English. And so the passive form is that to be verb plus the past participle spoken in this case. So English is spoken here. The active sentence is everyone or people speak English. Present progressive, you can see how the construction is. Excuse the mess, the house is being painted. So what you could say is that people are painting the house. That's the active. But that's not very interesting. It's more interesting and more common to say the house is being painted. All right. Then we have present perfect. I'll just read them quickly. Has Emily been told? Has been told. Then we have simple future. You'll be told soon enough. You will be told. Future perfect. Everything will have been done by Tuesday. Then we have the simple past. I wasn't invited, but I went. So the first part is passive. The second part is active. I went to the party. Past progressive. I felt as if I was being watched. I was being watched. And finally, past perfect. I knew why I had been chosen. So people had chosen me. I had been chosen. All right. So let's take a look a little bit more detail. If you have any questions, write them at the bottom in the little question box, and I will answer as many as I can. So let's look at the next, go into a little bit more detail on the active versus passive. So the difference with active, if you look at the top, John, the verb, so John is governing the action. John is taking the book. So John is doing the action, therefore John took the book is active because John is taking it. He's the one governing the action. The action is to take. If you receive the action, that's when you convert it to passive. So we look at the book was taken by John. So we have the passive tense was taken. The active took. Now I want to explain this in yet a different way. So I've explained it there from the position of the verb. Now I want to explain it from the position of the object. So take a look at this example here. So the same sentence. Now what we do if we want to convert from active to passive, and I'm going to ask you to do that at the end for homework. So if you want to do some homework, you'll have that. John took the book is the object, and you put it in the position of the subject. The book is now the subject, was taken by John. All right, this is basic stuff. I'm going to go into some more details, things I think you're going to be really interested in, because I'm going to talk about it in a way that perhaps isn't always talked about and try to be as user-friendly as possible. But before we do that, we have to identify the difference between active and passive. So here are 4 differences. So you begin to feel the difference. Then we're going to move on. They built this house in 1486. That's active. They built. That's how you know it's active. Now, we put the house, the object, in the position of the subject. We have the house was built by the workers, but that's not important or interesting. It's obvious. The house was built in 1486. In general, that's how this construction is. That's how you would say this, unless the people building the house were very special or important, or the subject of your talk. Most Austrians speak German, so we have Austrians speak, that's active. Then we invert the sentence. German is spoken. By whom? By most Austrians. A friend of ours is repairing the roof. We have here active, we move it to passive. The roof is being repaired. So is repairing is present continuous. The roof is being repaired is the passive continuous. All right, then number 4, the book will change your life. Your life will be changed by this book. So we have, that's the future passive there. Future passive, I think present, was it future perfect, I suppose. All right. Now, we often use the word by when we're doing this. So let's take a look at by. By is a very common agent. So by introduces the agent. So if you see by with an agent, it might signal that you have a passive construction. I was interviewed by 3 directors. The active is 3 directors interviewed me. So it depends, both are correct. It depends on the emphasis. Do you want to emphasize me, what I was doing? I was interviewed by 3 directors. Or if you want to emphasize the number of directors, 3 directors interviewed me. Number 2, my car was damaged by a falling branch. That's passive. Active, the falling branch damaged my car. So you have the word by, and that's the agent, by a falling branch. And we also have by here. All the trouble was caused by your mother. I hope not. But that in this case is the agent. The word by, the preposition by is very important here. Now what I'm going to do is something very different than what you'll see when you have most passive discussions on passive. I have selected what I consider to be some, not all, but many of the most common passive constructions. In other words, what you're likely to encounter in your English language. So I've just cherry-picked, selected the most common. So this is going to be interesting and hopefully user-friendly. So let's take a look at common uses in English. Again, these are what you'll commonly encounter as you learn or speak the language. Number 1, permit or allow. We often use the passive with permit or allow. Smoking is not allowed. So we don't say they don't allow smoking sometimes, but if you look at the sign, we would translate that smoking is not allowed, is not allowed. Next, we have hunting. Hunting is not permitted or is not allowed. You need a permit to hunt or to fish in the US anyway, but hunting is not allowed, is not permitted. And we use allowed in another sense, more sort of less official. Isa isn't allowed to stay out late on the weekends. Isn't allowed. Very common construction with allow and permit. So one thing you want to remember, and let is a little bit similar. Let and permit, I allow, I let you. I permit you. But here we have let, and it's a very common expression or construction in English. He was let out of prison, to be let out. He was let out of prison. Common. All right, here's another common use of passive. And it's one we encounter a lot if you're talking about yourself and you're introducing yourself to people. Born. I was born in the United States. I was raised in Kentucky. That's how we say that, in the passive form. We don't say, my mother birthed me in the US. That's active, but very unnatural English. I was born. We assume it's your mother. It's obvious. I was born in Kentucky, for example. Now, we also don't say my mother raised me in Toronto. We can say this, actually, if it's a specific question. But in general, I was raised is more common, but someone can raise you somewhere. That is possible. But the first option, birthed me, is not an option in English. Don't forget those. Those are very helpful. All right, here is another one that's very interesting and deals with English, actually. And that is with the word speak. You often hear English is spoken here. English is spoken here, and we use it in the passive form. You can use it in the active form. People speak English here. But people isn't really so interesting. So it's far more interesting as a sentence to just delete it. English is spoken here. We know it's spoken by people, so we don't need to include that in the sentence. All right, let's move to the next one. These are common uses of passive in English. Let me see here. All right. Expect. So if there's a notice, like a sign or a notice or a law or a rule in the company handbook, you might read, everyone is expected to be at work by 8 a.m. Everyone is expected. You don't hear as often, the management expects everyone to be at work at 8 a.m. That's the active form, but it's not. We don't say that in general. We say everyone is expected to be at work by 8 a.m. So that's a passive form. So when you don't need to tell us who is providing the law or who's giving the rules, making the rules, when that's not important, when the rule is important, as it often is, then you use passive. Here's another one that's very common. You will use this a lot in English if you talk about jobs and money. All right. Salary. When you talk about money, and we use here the word got, and get can be used in the passive form. And here are two very common examples of using get in the passive form. And here, the first one's about money. I got paid last week. That's the past passive. But we can say I get, if we want to talk about today in present tense or present form, present passive, I get paid today, which is almost future. I will get paid today. That's a passive. I get paid today. I got paid. And then another example is he got caught by the police speeding, or he got caught speeding by the police. And here we have a passive example, not with the word to be or the form of to be, but with the verb get, or in this case, got. He was caught, he got caught. He was paid, or I was paid, I got paid. Got is very common and almost more common than was in these examples. So these are ones you want to remember. Excuse me, let's go back. All right, next one we have is know and think. So know and think here are very common common uses in the passive, but sometimes we rather encounter this in writing more than speaking. He was known to be a troublemaker. It's possible to say this. I might say this, but you might very well see it in writing. Or he was known as a troublemaker. Both are, they're equivalents. They mean the same. He was known to be a troublemaker. He was known as a troublemaker. And here's a sort of a similar sort of idea with the passive. He was thought to be a spy. In other words, people thought he was a spy. Or people knew him as a troublemaker. So here we have uses in the passive that are very common. Oh, excuse me. Let's go back. Having trouble with this. Next, we have common phrases. These are two common phrases in the passive tense that you want to be aware of and try to use if possible. As is well known. More people. This is really common when you're giving a talk and you're about to say something that everyone knows, but you want to say it just to remind people to set up what you're going to say next. So this is important because if you say, so you might say, as is well known, the internet is everywhere. If I just said the internet is everywhere, people would say, obvious, that's obvious. Why did you say that? But if you say, as is well known, then you are letting everyone know that I know, you know, the internet is everywhere. As is well known, more people get colds in wet weather. As is well known is a really important phrase when you're speaking or giving a presentation and about to share information that everyone probably knows about, but it sets up your future argument. I'm sending you a bill as we agreed upon. This is more legal English. As was agreed upon. I'm sending you the bill, so you can put that up front. It's flexible. But what's interesting is this is more legal English. As was agreed upon, I'm delivering you 10 books. All right. This is a common expression. I heard it growing up, so I wanted, at least my father would say it a lot. So I want to share it with you. And it's a little bit more complicated, but was one that we would say not infrequently. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done. The active, there's a lot of work to do. But we would often use this in the passive. There's a lot of work to be done. And often it was my father telling us children that we have more housework to do. So don't leave. And I remember this phrase, oh, too well. All right. If you have any questions about any of these, you can ask them at the end. Now, I'm gonna raise the final point. Is a really important point. You don't want to miss this because I think it's really critical. Why use passive? Well, I've given you examples just now of, common passive phrases. So that's, I think, one reason is you have common phrases that are uttered or spoken or used in the passive form. And to use it in active form would, in many cases, be unnatural. So why use it? Number one, there are set phrases that we normally use in English. Number two, I've labeled it number one, but I've just mentioned one. So let's go and call this two, even though it says one. We use it to remove unneeded information. I've already mentioned this before. So for example, the teacher considered him a genius. If the teacher isn't important in this conversation, then we switch to passive and it's brilliant. He was considered a genius. The most important aspect of that sentence is that he's a genius, or that people think he's a genius. So we don't need the teacher in most cases. Let's look at another one. They elected Mrs. Sanderson president. If we don't, they isn't important here. The people voted. So Mrs. Sanderson was elected president. This makes the most sense. It's the most natural form. It's the passive. We all regarded Kathy as an expert. Kathy's regarded as an expert. Most people see him as a clown. He is seen as a clown. All right. So to remove unneeded information, which is often the subject, to remove the subject when it's obvious or not important. Here's the third example, although I label it 2, to emphasize the action. The water was polluted. You can tell us who polluted it. Hooligans polluted the water, or teenagers, if they were teenagers. But if that's not important who, if it's important what happened, then we use passive. The water was polluted. If it doesn't matter who polluted it, then we switch to passive and focus on the activity or the action, or in this case, the result of the water being polluted. All right, let's look at one other. Here we go. Number 3, but actually the fourth one, to keep the same subject. So look at this. He waited for 2 hours, then he was seen by a doctor, then he was sent back to the waiting room. Now, if you notice here, the first sentence is active. He waited 2 hours. That's active. But if we want to keep he in the first position, then we have to switch the next 2 sentences to passive. He was seen, not the doctor saw him. No, he was seen by the doctor. And then he was sent back to the waiting room, not the doctor sent him to the waiting room. So if we want to keep the same subject, we then revert or switch to passive. Now, this is very important if you're writing a story, which is why I put 3A. Passive is sometimes very good for storytelling, and this is one example of it, the one I've just given you. And then the fourth one I'll call my own because I didn't see it written anywhere, but I think it's also very important and one that you want to remember. And that is that it softens criticism. So instead of saying the writer or he or she, calling them out directly, misidentifies his assumptions, we can soften it by removing the person. It becomes a softer criticism. The assumptions were misidentified. So we leave out the person. So it's essentially, in the first sentence, we're pointing our finger, which is rude. And your parents say, don't point your finger. At least in America, we were not allowed to point our finger. Quit pointing. It was considered rude. But if we remove that, the person we're criticizing, it's like removing the pointed finger. So the assumptions were misidentified. And that's, I think, the fifth, not just the fourth, the fifth reason. Now, if you have any questions about any of these, I'll answer them in a moment. But first, I want to give you some homework. So the homework is to convert these 4 sentences from active. Here they're active. Convert them to passive. You can send them to me. You can write them below. I'm going to upload this video onto my Instagram account. So you can just write them underneath here, or you can send them directly to my inbox. So they get gradually more difficult.